On this 21 square mile island, we are literally our brother's keeper. Mr. Speaker, 100-year-old business institutions have closed. Restaurants and popular retail stores have shut their doors, and major sporting events were canceled. Our tourism and travel industries are decimated, resulting in the closure of some hotels, guest houses, and the very dramatic rise in unemployment across all sectors. This bleak economic picture will continue until we have COVID-19 under control. The One Bermuda Alliance believes that a healthy population is needed to support the development of a healthy economy. In addition, a robust national recovery plan must be crafted to guide Bermuda into an economic renaissance. Mr. Speaker, we also believe that this economic shock will provide opportunities for bold new initiatives, requiring us to revisit tried and proven programs, which deserve our immediate attention without political bias. We must examine new ways to work together towards a common end, as collectively we chart our way through the path of economic recovery and rehabilitation. Bermuda is small and agile enough to do it. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda needs an economic recovery plan, which is more than aspirational. The current budget presents details on the principles and aspiration of a plan, but unfortunately, it has not presented measurable milestones to define Bermuda's roadmap to economic recovery. Mr. Speaker, we must rebuild a vibrant economy, an economy where jobs are created with a focus on equity, diversity, fair trade, and real opportunities for Bermudians. We must find investors to support small businesses and our local economy, and we all must buy Bermuda. This rebuilding process should be supported by a realistic blueprint or an economic recovery plan. A recovery plan that is workable and addresses Bermuda's fiscal framework and infrastructure investment strategies. We must develop a bold prospectus for the country which will be attractive to potential investors, one that will build trust and a real bond with our business community through the deployment of taxes and business support, through the prioritization and delivery of green investments, through strategic investments in tourism and hospitality, the arts and creative sectors, seniors care, philanthropic sector, and let's not forget the critical support of our students. As a result of COVID-19, changes have taken place in the workplace. We must identify new skills training for the labor market, apprenticeships, and job guarantee programs, all of which will promote an economic framework that will value and support all of Bermuda's assets. Mr. Speaker, in 2021 and beyond, there is a view that there will be a better sense of normalcy by the end of the year. It is thought that this will be realized through the fields of medicine and health sciences. As we are nearing the one-year anniversary since the pandemic began, we can now see that globally there have been improvements in the management of the risk associated with the virus and its effects. As global citizens, we learn to better manage and live with COVID-19, much like the flu and the AIDS virus, which unfortunately have not been eliminated. There is now a sense of optimism that people should be able to go about their daily lives with the post-COVID-19 constraints, and that our economy should be poised to experience a reboot to more self-sustaining levels. This view was recently endorsed by the Honourable Matt Hancock, the UK Minister of Health. According to the BBC, Mr. Hancock commented that the adoption of vaccines and treatments by the end of the year, it could mean that COVID-19 will be an illness that we live with, like we do with the flu. He went on to say that he hoped that new drugs would be introduced by the end of 2021, which could make COVID-19 a treatable disease, and that the drugs and vaccines represent our way out to freedom. And further, the new treatments and new antibody treatments are needed for a small number who may not be protected by vaccines. Mr. Speaker, living with COVID-19 safely would also depend on vaccines to reduce the number of admitted to hospitals, reduce the number of deaths, reduce the transmission of the virus. Mr. Speaker, according to the IMF, in a report dated October 2020, A Long and Difficult Ascent, the global economy is climbing out of the depths to which it had plummeted during the lockdown in April. However, the pandemic continued to spread. Many countries slowed their reopening, and some are reinstating partial lockdowns to protect their vulnerable population. Global growth outlook and risks. According to the IMF, global growth was projected to be 4.4% in 2020, which is a less severe contraction than was forecasted in June 2020. This revision reflects a better than expected second quarter GDP result, mostly in advanced economies, which actually began to improve sooner than expected, after lockdowns were scaled back in May and June, as well as indicators of a strong recovery in the third quarter. Global growth is projected at 5.25% in 2021, a little more than the June 2020, which rejected the more moderate projected downturn for 2020 and is consistent with the expectations of persistent social distancing. Following the contraction in 2020 and recovery in 2021, the level of global GDP in 2021 is expected to be a modest 0.6% above that of 2019. The growth projections imply that there are wide negative output gaps, elevated unemployment rates this year, and well into 2020, across both advanced and emerging market economies. Impact on the U.S. economy. Mr. Speaker, a leading economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics stated that like many advanced 20 countries, there has been measurable advances in the management, containment, and acceptance of COVID-19 as a way of life, as evidenced by the U.S. economy, which is now showing the green shoots of recovery. There is also real evidence to indicate that the cases of COVID-19 are declining and hospitalizations are slowing down at a steady rate. These reductions are reportedly due to either prior infections, increased vaccinations, and increased efforts to achieve herd immunity. As a result, there is a real sense amongst many economists that when it comes to COVID-19, the U.S. is in the beginning stages of a sustained and permanent retreat, and that its economy is beginning to slowly reopen. It is further thought that the U.S. Congress may pass a relief bill worth approximately $1.7 trillion by the end of March 2021. This economic safety net will result in an extension of the company's enhanced unemployment benefits and provide a moratorium for evictions and foreclosures until September 2021. The U.S. media has also indicated that there will be payments of $1,400 to most households. Mr. Speaker, with this type of economic support and fiscal stimulus, economists agree that normal life in the U.S. will resume for the most part by the middle of this year. It is expected that as COVID infections subside and restrictions are lifted, the consumer confidence will increase, along with the corresponding increase in consumer spending, especially in the various service sectors. They went on to indicate that by March 2021, U.S. households will have accumulated savings balances of some $2 trillion, which is almost 10% of the GDP since February 2020. This is due largely to the savings generated by the enforced cutbacks on spending on discretionary services and stimulus payments to households. Pent-up demand for leisure, recreation, entertainment, and travel-related services are also forecasted to reach unprecedented levels. Economists further believe that the U.S. dollar is at one of its lowest levels from a trading perspective, and that a U.S. economic rebound is inevitable, and capital would head back to the U.S. as COVID-19 fades. We believe that this positive outlook will provide invaluable benefits to Bermuda, as the U.S. is our largest trading partner. The EU challenges. Mr. Speaker, in the 2013 report by the European Parliament Directorate General for Internal Policies, entitled European Initiatives on Eliminating Tax Havens and Offshore Financial Transactions and the Impact of These Constructions on the Union's Own Resources and Budget, they reviewed the impact of tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions, and similar structures on the EU. The report concludes that the availability of these structures constrains the EU budget and undermines the fiscal recovery of the EU. Member states, they distort markets by conferring advantages on large companies that engage in transfer pricing. The report notes that the shadow economy in the U.S. is estimated to be approximately $2 trillion, and that tax evasion is estimated to be 1 trillion euros annually. It is further noted that recent reports suggested that the tens of billions of euros are held offshore and unreported and untaxed. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe recently commented that Council of Europe member states lose billions every year due to tax avoidance, tax evasion, and tax fraud, which are facilitated by the offshore financial systems, including tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions. This massive tax cheating by wealthy individuals and enterprises not only penalizes ordinary taxpayers, public finances, and social spending, but also threatens good governance, macroeconomic stability, and social cohesion. Mr. Speaker, the report takes the view that offshore financial centers are widely perceived to have contributed to the financial crisis that emerged in 2007. The holding of vast funds in the secretive offshore centers enables financial institutions to hide vital information from governments, regulators, rating agencies, and the public. This means that they escape proper regulation and public scrutiny. This enables them to take a greater risk than would be possible with full transparency. And governments, regulators, rating agencies, and investors lack the level of information required to make informed decisions. In turn, this leads to financial instability, with taxpayers having to cover the cost of rectifying the resulting problems. They believe that the use of tax havens for transfer pricing and tax evasion has a negative impact on the EU revenues by reducing the gross national income of member states. Moreover, lower tax revenues are likely to have a negative impact on the willingness of member states to increase or maintain their contributions to the EU. Tax havens facilitate the activities of tax evaders and criminal organizations. Combating these activities consume resources that could otherwise be used for productive investments. The ability to engage in transfer pricing gives large corporations a significant advantage over small companies, which undermines the EU's efforts to develop the small and medium-sized enterprise sectors and may constrain employment creation. Mr. Speaker, in light of the above, Bermuda is unfairly deemed to be on the EU's blacklist. Consequently, despite our continued engagement with the Commission and the Code of Conduct Group and its constructive and cordial relationships with its relevant officials, in principle, nothing has really changed for Bermuda since 2013. We continue to have an uphill battle when conducting business in the EU, especially after Brexit. That fact is, Mr. Speaker, that Bermuda has no heavyweight friends or influencers who can successfully lobby on our behalf at the national and international levels. If the EU takes the view that tax havens have a negative impact on EU revenues by reducing gross national income of its member states, Bermuda will be looked upon with suspicion and will be challenged to conduct real business in the EU. They will continue to place hurdles in our economic lanes, given their perception of tax havens and the impact on the EU states. In fact, Mr. Speaker, as recently as last month, the European Union politicians were calling for any jurisdictions with a 0% tax rate on corporate profits, including Bermuda, to be included on the EU list of non-cooperative jurisdiction. What makes this even more challenging, as our finance minister has indicated, is that the body that makes the list has given no indication of changes in the listing criteria. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda should form a strategic alliance with members listed on the EU's blacklist. They should form an alliance with influential lobbyists, NGOs, and other influencers that work within the European Parliament and its states. In so doing, this alliance can leverage its collective economic power, it can leverage its global influence, and its contributions to the international financial markets. Bermuda 2021-22 Economy and Budget. Mr. Speaker, many Bermuda residents see this budget as very aspirational and one that lacks details. It provides very little hope and is likely the most non-specific budget statement ever presented. It is as though the onset of COVID pandemic was viewed as a get-out-of-jail to dismiss the economic challenges facing Bermuda that were in existence prior to the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the budget statement is to give the public two specific things. One, a report and analysis of the government's finances for the past fiscal year within the context of the overarching external conditions and government objectives. 2, it will provide the government's plans for the country for the next fiscal year and how those plans will affect government's revenues, expenditures, and balance sheet. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance has failed to deliver either one of those objectives in any kind of robust or detailed fashion. Instead, he has merely listed off a number of issues facing the country without any specific plan as to how to meet these challenges. There is virtually no analysis or context other than COVID-19 of government's financial performance. What is being produced is a list of principles, but even that was poorly executed because the list is only a mixture of principles and objectives. For example, combating COVID-19 is an objective. Reducing the cost of living is an objective. Fairness and equity are principles. Fiscal prudence is a principle. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 pandemic transcends national borders through aviation, ground transportation, and shipping. Its social and economic impact is the same. As we all have seen, as the COVID-19 numbers spike, the health of our population becomes more challenged. As populations isolate and quarantines increase, economic confidence declines. Business sales declines. Unemployment increases. Furloughs increases. Homes are lost. Loans become unserviceable. And the contraction of various businesses and economies continues. This is the story around the world. From a health perspective, Bermuda's economic recovery is admirable, and the Bermuda government should be commended for the work they've done and the work they continue to do. In fact, the Pan American Health Organization and the U.S. Center for Disease Control at one point raised the island's country status from clusters of COVID-19 cases to sporadic cases in recognition for the success that our country has achieved in containing the pandemic. In light of this, all Bermudians must continue to make their personal contribution if we are to minimize the health devastation left in the wake of COVID-19. The mitigation measures include social distancing, self-isolation, quarantining, when warranted, using personal protective equipment, and adhering to standards prescribed by the World Health Organization, POCA, and the U.S. Center for Disease Control and other agencies. Mr. Speaker, as a well-known fiscal responsibility panel economist said, if you have a healthy and productive population, you will also have a more productive economy. Mr. Speaker, despite the above, the fact still remains that Bermuda's economy continues to contract, given that our 2020 gross domestic product is projected to fall by 7 to 9%. Mr. Speaker, what the reduction of GDP means for Bermuda is more jobs for Bermudians, especially small businesses, which play a vital role in the Bermuda's economic engine. In retail sector, businesses such as beauty salons, fitness-related facilities, and businesses within the hospitality sector will continue to bear the brunt of job losses. Apparel stores and service stations will continue to decline. These businesses face the threat of closure due to the added COVID-19 restrictions placed on them. They will likely not be able to pay their overhead costs, rents, and other expenses due to the dramatic decline in revenues. Low-wage earners who clean, prepare, and serve food within the private and public sectors are also significantly impacted. They will experience the most job redundancies and will be hit with increasing unemployment. For those who keep their jobs, they likely will not have a wage increase for years or are faced with reduced working hours. Tourism was catastrophically affected by COVID-19. Our cruise ship industry has all but vanished, with the related revenues down approximately 90% for 2020. The construction industry will continue to suffer as Bermuda's construction projects fell by 41.3% for the first 6 months of the fiscal year 2021, and there is no relief on the horizon. Mr. Speaker, despite this status, economically, Bermuda must place its economy on a path of higher productivity and growth, while ensuring that benefits are shared evenly and that our debt is manageable. This is not an easy task, as other countries find it difficult to have trade-offs between implementing measures to support economic expansion and avoiding a further build-up of debt. There are those who believe that investments in health, education, and high-return infrastructure projects will also help move the country forward to a green economy. Research spending can facilitate innovation and technology adoption, which are the primary drivers of long-term productivity growth. Others believe that we cannot spend or grow our economy without extending our workforce or population. Mr. Speaker, we should also cooperate with other countries and regulators on the design of international corporate taxation to respond to the challenges of the digital economy. With the continued uncharted path of the pandemic, Bermuda must ensure that our healthcare can continue to cope with its demands. This means that we should continue to secure adequate resources, prioritize healthcare spending as needed, including testing, contract tracing, personal protective equipment, life-saving equipment such as ventilators, and facilities, such as emergency rooms, intensive care units, and isolation wards. Considering the above, Bermuda must continue to fight to contain the pandemic, which can be implemented by adopting measures to lower its transmission and set the stage for an eventual economic recovery due to mobility constraints. We should also limit the damage by supporting earnings losses for the affected people and firms. Retraining and reskilling of Bermudians should continue to the extent that is feasible, so that workers can look for jobs in other sectors. As this transaction may take some time, displaced workers need extended income support as they retrain and search for jobs. Mr. Speaker, we believe that as we reopen, our government must support the recovery by gradually removing targeted support, facilitating the reallocation of workers and resources to sectors less affected by social distancing, and providing stimulus where needed and to the extent possible. Some physical resources freed from targeted support should be redeployed to public investment, including in renewable energy, improving efficiency of the power transmission, and retrofitting buildings to reduce their carbon footprint. Moreover, as lifelines are unwound, social spending should be expanded to protect the most vulnerable. And where gaps exist in the safety net, authorities could enhance paid family and sick leave, expand eligibility for unemployment benefits, and strengthen health care benefit coverage as needed. Creating a nimble government. Mr. Speaker, as stated in the Sage Commission report, when comparing the size of Bermuda's government with other jurisdictions, and when tracking its growth during the past 20 years, the Sage Commission believed that Bermuda's government is disproportionately larger than it needs to be to conduct its business and to deliver necessary services to taxpayers. Currently, there are 36 members of the House of Assembly, 11 senators, 12 ministers, 72 departments, 13 quasi-non-governmental organizations, 16 related entities, and approximately 5,070 employees. Additionally, our multi-layered management structure and excessive decentralization has led to unnecessary red tape, poor communications, and delayed decision-making. Bermuda has a disproportionate number of paid legislators when compared to many other countries. As our elected and appointed representatives address the island's economic challenges, the SAGE Commissions believe that Bermuda had an opportunity to demonstrate their belief that the sacrifice needed to regain Bermuda's financial footing must be shared by all. Mr. Speaker, it is important to note that while the SAGE report was written 7 years ago, its recommendations are as workable today as they were when the report was first written. For example, the Commission recommended that the cost of running the Bermuda legislature could be reduced by 15%. In the first instance, the Commission recommended that the House of Assembly should be reduced from 36 to 30 seats. Secondly, they recommended that the size of the Cabinet should be reduced to a maximum of 8 members, including the Premier. These reductions represent savings in salaries and benefits. The Premier can carry out the reduction in the size of the Cabinet now. Until both recommendations are implemented, the SAGE Commission recommended that the ministers and members of the legislature take an immediate reduction in salary equal to the reduction in salaries and wages of the civil and public service. And as the cost savings do not equal the targeted 15%, the Commission recommended that the remaining areas of the legislature's budget should be reduced to make up the difference, and or make further reductions in the salary of the members and ministers of the legislature. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. While some of these recommendations have been actioned, we believe that these recommendations can serve to demonstrate to the Bermuda community that our parliamentarians are serious about addressing the chronic debt crisis. Moreover, and that the leadership should lead by example, starting at the top. The Commission further recommended the following reductions to the organizational structure of the government. Ministries, as I said earlier, from 12 to a maximum of 8. Departments from 72 to 52. Quangos from 13 to 12. Organizations where government has administrative responsibility from 9 to 8. Now I'll move to the next topic, Mr. Speaker. Reliance on the One Bermuda Alliance capital projects helps boost the current economy. Mr. Speaker, for over the past 3 years, there has been a reliance on several OBA projects to materially boost Bermuda's GDP and create jobs. Unfortunately, we have not seen any meaningful action to manifest the promises made by the PLP. The reality is the promises made by the PLP have been broken. In its 2020 election platform, the PLP pledged to a target return to a balanced budget within 3 years, within 3 fiscal years, when tourism was fully recovered following the pandemic. They made repeated promises to balance the pre-pandemic budget and have failed. In fact, as recently as February 3rd of this year on the television broadcast, the Minister of Finance indicated that he hoped to have a balanced budget by 2023. How exactly will this happen? Where is the detailed plan? Why should we believe them this time? Indeed, with the ongoing effects of COVID-19 and with no detailed plan to resurrect our economy, it appears that Bermuda is destined to further increase in the size of our national debt, which is well on its way to almost $4 billion. A debt of that size will undoubtedly cripple our ability to put money where it is most needed, which is into social support networks, into stopping violence, and into improving health care and the well-being of Bermudians, especially as debt servicing is costing us $127.8 million per year. Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance stands by its economic policies. We know that it suits the naysayers to play down our achievements, but our efforts were nothing short of an economic miracle. Mr. Speaker, on our watch, world-class events came to the island. New hotels and a new airport was created. It created wealth and new jobs for Bermudians, and the OBA attracted $1 billion of inward investment to Bermuda. While those were some of the OBA's accomplishments to make it to the headlines, the OBA did so much more. Mr. Speaker, we created the Bermuda Tourism Authority, and under its leadership, Bermuda had seen record tourism arrivals. Now that it has been politicized, will we see the same level of success? Recognizing the need to bring more tourists to Bermuda during the shoulder season, we worked with the BTA to bring events such as the World Triathlon Series to the island. We negotiated a deal to bring 12 cruise ships to the old town of St. George's from 2017 to 2022. Under the agreement with Norwegian Cruise Lines, NCL agreed to bring 2 new catamaran ferries to the island for a run from Dockyard to the East End, along with a yearly investment of $150 million by NCL to sponsor tourism enhancement products and projects. Mr. Speaker, on the OBA's watch, we created the Bermuda Business Development Agency to help bring new businesses to Bermuda. And long before the PLP, we were exploring the opportunity of outer space when we began discussions with NASA of a more permanent facility at Cooper's Island. Further, we granted a 15-year exclusive contract to develop Bermuda's satellite slot. Aware of the need for sustainability and to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, it was the OBA who started the process of getting a solar photovoltaic project on the finger at the L.F. Wade International Airport. Mr. Speaker, the small electric rental cars we now see on Bermuda's roads today were a result of legislation that the OBA passed, allowing rental mini cars in Bermuda for the first time in our history. As a result, there are now at least 4 rental businesses providing safer transportation for visitors and jobs for Bermudians. Mr. Speaker, Caroline Bay. Mr. Speaker, Morgan's Point has been a prominent place in the budget statement, and consequently, I will share some history with the people of Bermuda on this matter. Morgan's Point was a poison chalice almost from the start. How so, you would question? The ground was poisoned by the U.S. Navy, and the contract that was signed by the previous PLP government with Morgan's Point Limited was poisoned by the obligation to clean up the entire site to a residential one standard at government's cost and the Bermuda taxpayers' cost. As the project progressed, the developer threatened to sue the then government for $100 million if they did not comply with the development agreement. Mr. Speaker, after long and difficult negotiations, government agreed to clean up the sections of the site where cleanup was possible and retain for itself the areas where it was impossible. We did that at a cost of approximately $30 million. Notwithstanding all of this, it was still a brownfield, and as such, investment funding would not be forthcoming without government's guarantee. To lay the infrastructure for the long-term future of our tourism industry, create opportunities for local businesses and jobs for Bermuda, the decision was made to guarantee certain loans for the project. Unfortunately, the project failed. Nevertheless, despite the negative result of this case, government guarantees are generally required from overseas financiers to finance major projects in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, the question is, what now? The government has said plenty of time to formulate a plan for the future of Morgan's Point. What is the plan? We were hoping that this would be articulated in the budget statement. I have to say that it is disappointing not to see the plan in this statement. Mr. Speaker, while on the topic of Carolina Bay, what happened with the Morgan's Point liquidation? What did the government actually receive for the $165 million expended for the adoption of the loans? Again, the Minister of Finance has been thrifty with these details. Business confidence. Mr. Speaker, to contrast the OBA's accomplishment under the PLP leadership, Bermuda has seen the lowest business confidence level ever. New and increased taxes have significantly impacted small Bermudian businesses who can least afford it, and we have seen the implosion of retail businesses as well as the loss of hundreds of jobs in the sector, which was described by one minister as insignificant. It is important to note that none of these casualties were as a result of COVID-19. Agonizingly, we have seen Bermuda's debt rise by $1 billion in 12 months, which is absolutely incredible. Mr. Speaker, there have always been little progress in gaming, and an untendered deal for an arbitration center for which no financial details have been provided. Gaming. Mr. Speaker, there has been no mention of gaming in the 2021 budget statement. In the past 2 or 3 years, the topic of gaming has been very popular, as it is an amenity which can support our ever-evolving tourism industry. We note in the budget that there is a 125% increase in the Cabinet Office, where the government's gaming infrastructure is managed. Is this extra $21.69 million allocation for the gaming industry? Mr. Speaker, the Gaming Commission has issued 2 provisional licenses to 2 world-class resorts, and these resorts are unable to move forward with their gaming offering because the proper legislative and operational framework is not in place. Moreover, the banking component of the structure has not been resolved, even though we are making progress in this space. Mr. Speaker, I've been advised that the delay in the gaming lies at the feet of the Premier, and that the banking matter can be resolved if the Premier does what he's supposed to do. Mr. Speaker, there are those who have vast experience in the gaming industry who believe that gaming should be removed from the Premier and the Cabinet Office portfolio and transferred to the Minister of Finance. Senior international bankers also have indicated that they are not aware of any advanced nation where gaming is under the control of or under the purview of a country's head of state, i.e. Premier, Prime Minister, or President. In addition, there are stakeholders who believe that the overarching Gaming Commission legislation must be amended so that the Commission is independent of government influence and interference. These should include the removal of the requirement that a government representative sit on the board of the commission. In fact, it was noted that the Gaming Commission should have the same type of independence and autonomy as the Bermuda Monetary Authority. As most in our country are aware, the current government has indicated that operationally, Bermuda will be progressing with a cashless gaming solution. What does a cashless gaming solution mean? Are we talking about credit cards only? Are we talking about cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Tether, through blockchain solutions? Transparency is required, as potential operators who are prepared to invest in this industry are not clear on government's cashless gaming direction. This matter must be resolved soon, especially as a new hotel will be launched before this summer. Considering the above, we must get it right, as government has a responsibility to fulfill its obligations as prescribed under the various hotel development agreements which are in place in our tourism industry. International business. Bermuda's international business has continued to tick over well despite COVID-19 and the debacle in travel. It has been said that from chaos comes opportunities, and all this chaos is having a major turn in the right direction for the global property and casualty insurance underwriting market. For the first time in 15 years, underwriting rates are hardening and rising. There is a significant tailwind for our ABA members. There was a similar market which incentivized many international insurance and reinsurance company giants to flock to Bermuda years ago. As mentioned at the recent budget breakfast by the Director of Policy at ABA, their members contributed some $830 million to renew Bermuda's economy by ways of contributions to such areas as construction, travel, entertainment, housing, and other contributions. In addition, they showcased the fact that 1,756 of the total number of employees, 72% are Bermudian. Mr. Speaker, new capital is coming into our market. Many of Bermuda's major carriers have already raised $12 billion in new capital, according to the chairman of and CEO of Arch Worldwide Reinsurance Group. Most of this new capital went to existing companies, and approximately $2 billion went into new companies. With this infusion in existing and new companies, Bermuda will see the multiplier effect. However, while much needed capital is coming to the island, the new landscape will not be similar to previous landscapes. Companies are now outsourcing many of their back office functions to jurisdictions outside of Bermuda. IT servers have been relocated overseas. Employees are working remotely from Canada, the UK, the US, and Europe. More and more administrative work is being outsourced to more competitive jurisdictions, and business analytic models are being purchased off the shelves, thereby robbing our people of job opportunities and employment. Considering the above, Mr. Speaker, our job as parliamentarians is to encourage such companies to fill their positions locally. This can be accomplished by making the immigration process more accommodating and by removing some of the bureaucratic red tape which stymies a productive and welcoming business environment. We cannot afford to lose this momentum, as it is the only tailwind that we currently have. Mr. Speaker, we must encourage government to get out of the way and allow Bermuda to grow. In 2018, Bermuda hosted an event that has been referred to as the Davos of Ocean Science. It is time now that we consider hosting a similar Ocean Risk Summit, an event for climate change risk. In so doing, Mr. Speaker, Bermuda can reposition herself to also be the center of excellence for an international climate change risk market. Digital commerce. Mr. Speaker, quite a lot is also being said about the tangible opportunities in the digital commerce arena in Bermuda, and the One Bermuda Alliance supports this discussion. With Bermuda's legislative, regulatory, and telecommunications framework and digital communications infrastructure, we stand ready to capitalize on the emerging and growing industry. We expect the provision of robust training and internship programs and the creation of new jobs for Bermudians. In addition, from a taxation perspective, the digital sector will provide benefits from the taxation schemes currently in place in Bermuda, such as company taxes, payroll taxes, and land taxes. The government should consider further examination of a negotiated value-added tax for the privilege of booking their local and global internet business earnings from Bermuda. This approach is not new, and the industry is familiar with it. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in the absence of a new international rule book, similar member governments are planning their own digital service taxes. They are taking this action because of growing public pressure on multinationals like Google, Facebook, and Amazon to pay their share under international tax rules after COVID-19 strained national budgets. Base rates. Mr. Speaker, the government's recent throne speech indicated that the legislature will be invited to consider bills to reform banking laws and regulations and to establish a Bermuda base interest rate. It goes on to say that the reform of banking laws will increase competition in this section, introduce new classes of banks to boost the economy, and harmonize the bank base rate, while at the same time working with banks to reduce the interest rates charged on mortgages. Mr. Speaker, here I will declare my interest. I am a banker. Mr. Speaker, before the government embarks upon this journey, may I suggest that the government build consensus with the Bermuda Banking Association, and that also it secures the blessings and support of the Banking Association members. I'm saying this because of the unintended consequences. The reality is that there are two large international banks on the island, which likely provides approximately 65 to 70% of Bermuda's loans and mortgages. If they are not on board with government proposals, and if they prescribed base rate impacts their earnings and return on assets, then the same banks will stealthily exercise their option and will quietly and drastically reduce their mortgage and loan portfolio footprint in Bermuda. They can redeploy their assets and the availability of loans and mortgages to their other branches or subsidiaries in other jurisdictions. In simple terms, if we do not get this right, the availability of mortgages and loans to Bermudians will decrease exponentially, and the bank's assets will be used to support the rapid growth of their mortgage and loan footprints in other jurisdictions such as Cayman, Bahamas, BVI, Jersey, Guernsey, the US, and the UK. Mr. Speaker, I reiterate, we must be aware of the unintended consequence, as this move may come back to bite us. Immigration. Immigration reform has been a thorny and very emotional issue for successive governments of Bermuda and her people. It has been a political football, and with the aid of successive PLP governments, this issue has stoked civil unrest. But despite the above, the Progressive Labour Party has begun to make progress in this space. Their government is just beginning to recognize that Bermuda's workforce and population must expand. Mr. Speaker, the PLP government is finally accepting the fact that a good immigration policy is a good economic policy. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, the Minister of Immigration introduced the Economic Investment Certificate and the Residential Certificate policy, which enable investors to apply for the right to live in Bermuda indefinitely on the condition that they invest a minimum of $2.5 million into the economic well-being of Bermuda, which will add value to our economy. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda also has approved applications for 400 digital nomads who are also welcomed. But how many have actually moved to Bermuda under this residential program? For years, the OBA tried to revise the current Immigration Act, but we could not do so because of the civil unrest in our community. And today, the Progressive Labour Party is finally seeing the light. A good immigration policy is a good economic policy. Mr. Speaker, we are seeing the promotion of several reforms that the One Bermuda Alliance recommended, especially with mixed status families, as well as the idea of commercial immigration, which was initially presented by the former OBA Immigration Minister, the Honorable Michael Fahey, JP MP. Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, we also note that a full review of the Immigration Act of 1956 is a must. It's draconian, dated, and well over 60 years old. Its original purpose and features are no longer relevant to the Bermuda we enjoy today. It just does not support our 21st century economy with all its nuances and challenges. Considering the above, our current government must grab the proverbial nettle, stop the political sophistry, and embark upon an immigration review that will help to expand Bermuda's workforce, and in turn will form the foundation of Bermuda's economic growth. It will also create a pathway to residency and citizenship, while at the same time protect the interests of Bermudians and Bermudian jobs. Based on Ruchir Sharma's 10 Rules of Successful Nations, increasing the populations has accounted for roughly half of economic growth, and that if population is shrinking, it is close to impossible to generate strong economic growth. As the European Commission stated in 2005, never in history has there been economic growth without population growth. Mr. Speaker, for the edification of our country, let me explain why the expansion of our workforce is crucial. Debt service, and deficit. More working people in Bermuda means greater payroll tax collection and more local consumption, which increases customs duties. A greater residential population creates a multiplier effect on our two biggest buckets of tax. Healthcare costs. Guest workers are generally younger and healthier than our average resident. Increasing the number of guest workers massively improves the sustainability of our healthcare system. Aging population. Increasing working age population, with all else staying the same, directly reduces our maintenance ratio. Total healthcare costs and aging population are closely intertwined. Global compliance requirements. Many companies are going to have to do more to justify their presence in Bermuda under the new tax regimes. We are competing with other jurisdictions on this front and must present a welcoming attitude. Narrow economy. More working age people on the island decrease the tax load per person. Mr. Speaker, keeping it real, our economy, social wellness, and security are inextricably linked with immigration, more so than any other jurisdiction. We are a service economy with no physical exports and only two pillar industries, one which produces much of our foreign exchange, employment, and tax revenues, i.e. international business. It is time that the immigration review must start, and it must start now. Immigration reform just makes good business sense. Pensions for investment. Mr. Speaker, once again, the Minister of Finance is silent when it comes to the unfunded liability for our Public Service Superannuation Fund, the Government Health Insurance Fund, and the members of the Legislature and Ministerial Fund. For the record, it stands at approximately $1.47 billion based on the latest Auditor General's report. Will our government's employees have a pension that they can draw on when they retire in the years to come? Mr. Speaker, this question is not unreasonable, given that the total liability due to our pension plan participants and government note holders now stands at $4.7 billion. Mr. Speaker, if we are going to be truly transparent, we should note that our government funded some of their stimulus programs on the back of pension plans, pension holidays, which only kick the can further down the road. Here it should also be noted that the superannuation fund shortfalls are of course funded through the consolidated fund and will need to be addressed at some point. Additional capital development spending. The throne speech indicates that under normal circumstances, governments the world over increases their capital expenditure to stimulate the economy and create projects to help to get its citizens back to work after natural disasters and dramatic economic downturns. But these are not normal times, with the government debt ceiling at $3.5 billion and no surplus budget possibilities in the near future. Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance created an environment that incentivized foreign investment, such as the St. Regis Hotel and the Azure Bermuda Hotel. We engineered innovative public-private sector schemes, such as the airport, and promoted international events such as the America's Cup, which alone brought $350 million to our economy and stimulated jobs and commerce, representing a sizable return on the public purse's spending. This present government has not demonstrated that type of ingenuity and prowess. Is capital development spending needed to now upgrade our infrastructure and to stimulate our stagnant economy? The answer is yes. Does this government have the ability to make this happen while adequately addressing its debt and at the same time not going into further debt and maintaining its present service levels while trimming the fat of the government spending? Past performance of this administration and the contents of its recent throne speech does not convince us that it can. Mr. Speaker, while on the topic of capital development, it should be noted that the One Bermuda Alliance recognizes the need for infrastructure development. When we were government, we implemented a number of large infrastructure projects, some successful and some were not. One that was not successful was the Fortress Bermuda Infrastructure Fund. This was the brainchild of Brian Duperreault and the Honorable E.T. Bob Richards. The idea was to create a for-profit investment fund to improve the infrastructure in Bermuda, funded by the reinsurance industry that has assets of $2/3 of $1 trillion. Yes, $1 trillion in investments outside of Bermuda. A number of ABR companies bought into the idea, and Fortress Investments of New York were to be hired to manage it. It was supposed to be about $250 million in size. But in the final analysis, in March 2017, the proposal realized firm commitments of only $66 million, and Fortress wanted $1 million per year in fees. We consequently declined that offer. However, after the 2017 election, one of the first things Premier Burt did and his government did was to sign the same deal. As far as we know, government has paid Fortress $5 million for this infrastructure fund. Where do we stand today? What value has the country received for the $5 million payment to Fortress? Update taxation system. Mr. Speaker, the throne speech proposes that the Tax Reform Commission of 2018 should update its recommendations in light of the new economic realities created by the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, our question to this government is, have they read the 2019 report? And if they've read the report, what have they done thus far to implement these recommendations? We submit that there are recommendations found in the report that are fair and equitable. They do not place undue burden on the lower paid workers of this country, and which do a lot to effectively broaden the tax base without stifling the economy. But like the SAGE report, the Fiscal Responsibility Panel's report, and other similar reports, this government apparently has no appetite for them, nor have they put into practice recommendations made by these commissioners. Revised tax structure. Mr. Speaker, the Financial Responsibility Panel recommends that the country should brace itself for a revised tax structure. The panel feels that the current tax structure is unsustainable in addressing Bermuda's current economy. In real terms, this may mean more taxes for the people of Bermuda, given that they believe that a reasonable tax revenue as a percentage of GDP should be around 19 to 20%. That would be an increase of approximately $190 million over 3 years. In addition, it should be noted that with the imminent embodiment of the Tax Reform Committee, a more fair and equitable tax structure is being examined, which could result in an increase in all of our current personal tax liabilities. Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is that we need enough taxes to run government and no more. Without taxes, we cannot effectively run government. Government accounts receivables. Mr. Speaker, it should also be noted that this current budget has not addressed the government's $100 million account receivable portfolio realized from across all government ministries. Neither did they present any management strategies, write-off strategies, or recovery strategies. In today's environment, this government should not and cannot entertain any suggestion of implementing overdue tax amnesties or tax forgiveness for delinquent taxpayers who meet certain eligibility requirements. This is a slap in the face for those taxpayers who have been diligent, made sacrifices, and found the wherewithal to pay their bills when they come due. Some who may not have had the money to pay their bills entered arranged payment plans to ensure that they meet their commitments. In some instances, if a company needed work permits, such work permits were withheld until delinquent accounts were made current. To forgive those who just did not bother to pay or to enter into payment plans will establish a precedent whereby responsible companies will hold on to their money with the view of waiting out the time to get a write-off. Bermuda's national debt. Bermuda's national debt continues to rise unabated. As I mentioned earlier this year, Bermuda can expect that our national debt will hover around $4 billion during the next fiscal year. The Minister of Finance is rightfully concerned. Indeed, we all should be very concerned. He indicated that the government's budget deficit is expected to be an unsustainable $245 million for the year 2021 after the COVID pandemic, with slashed revenues and soaring expenditures. If we continue this glide path, we will see another increase in Bermuda's debt ceiling. The Fiscal Responsibility Panel said in their 2020 report that an adverse but far more inconceivable scenario would see government debt on an unsustainable trajectory, leading to a credit rating downgrade and higher interest rates on new debt, the risk of large emergency tax increases and spending cuts, and the possibility of capital flight and a foreign exchange crisis. The FRP also indicated that given the fiscal position and the limited progress of the government acting on either of their earlier recommendations, they are concerned that Bermuda will have little fiscal or macroeconomic policy bandwidth to address any crystallization of these risks. Over the long term, their key concern is still domestic, i.e., the island's shrinking workforce and aging population. This challenge will put ever-increasing pressure on both taxes and spending. Mr. Speaker, according to the Fiscal Responsibility Panel, the issue is not whether action is needed or even what actions are needed. There is already a high degree of consensus in both their reports and those of other independent bodies, and indeed within government, that action is needed now. This action includes immigration reform, tax reform, and changes to the structure of health care and pensions, which are all necessary. Debt service. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda's annual debt service is completely out of control. This money is paid to our local and international bondholders. For the year ending March 31st, 2021, the annual expense will total approximately $127 million, or approximately 11.4% of the estimated expenditures. This expense is the third largest government expense after the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health. It is almost larger than the Ministry of Youth, Sports, and Community Affairs, Social Development and Seniors, and the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Ministry of Transport combined. And Mr. Speaker, most of this money leaves Bermuda and does not circulate in our economy for further use by our people. The sinking fund. Mr. Speaker, the current budget statement indicates that the Minister of Finance plans to finance his deficit from the sinking fund. The Royal Gazette stated that the sinking fund was devised by the late David Soul for a rainy day just like this one. Mr. Speaker, for clarity, Bermuda should note that the sinking fund was set up specifically to provide for the retirement of debt. In fact, the annual contribution was earmarked annually at 2.5% of the outstanding debt for the expiring fiscal year. What will the Progressive Labor Party government policy be going forward? Will the sinking fund contributions be made in times of plenty, when we have current account surplus? Will the suspension of our contributions to the sinking fund be permanently on the table, or will the suspension be temporary? How are we going to establish a reserve to retire the growing debt which Bermuda faces as a result of Progressive Labor Party governments? Mr. Speaker, it should also be noted that the One Bermuda Alliance amended this policy slightly, so that when we could raise large, cheap borrowings, we would place the excess in the sinking fund and take it out as needed. It was not intended to mix the money set aside for debt repayment with excess borrowed money for operations. But that, Mr. Speaker, is exactly what is taking place. Income tax. Mr. Speaker, income tax recently became a topical issue in Bermuda, especially when it comes to addressing economic inequality. Mr. Speaker, as my friend and former political colleague and former Minister of Finance, the Honorable E.T. Bob Richards indicated, and I quote, "The United States and Britain have had a system of income tax for over 100 years, yet income equality is still a significant issue there. In a recent study of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which has 37 member countries, the U.S. was the fourth highest in terms of income inequality. Britain was the fifth highest. In the U.S., the top 1% earns 38% of the entire country's income. The income gap has widened over the past 40 years. A Pew Research study showed that in 1968, the top 20% earned 40% of the nation's income, while in 2018, the top 20% earned 52% of the nation's income. Across the Atlantic, it is said that there are more billionaires in Britain per capita than any other developed country in the world. Billionaire Warren Buffett once said that his secretary paid a higher percentage in tax on her income than he did. So much so for tax promoting income equality. That premise in the real world is patently false. Mr. Speaker, legislating income tax is easy. Collecting income tax is another matter. The structure of Bermuda's private sector creates a peculiar challenge in collecting income taxes. Take dividends, for example. If I own 100 shares of Bank of Butterfield, the dividend would be paid to me and there would be a clear audit trail if I failed to declare it as income. But most local businesses are privately held, family-owned enterprises. In such cases, it would be easy in a myriad of ways to extract a return on your capital without paying a dividend. Mr. Speaker, the cost of collecting such passive income will be enormous. In a large country, that cost can be spread over millions of taxpayers, but not in Bermuda. We would have to swell the civil service just to attempt to collect such taxes. But wealthy people have the resources to hire tax professionals to mitigate their tax burden, while the average and poor people do not. In Bermuda, a balance must be struck between levying taxes and the cost of collecting taxes, and the cost of doing business in Bermuda, and the cost of living in Bermuda. Mr. Richards' enlightened remark speaks volumes on the implementation of income tax to correct inequities. To summarize, Bermuda should measure twice and cut once, as income tax is not the panacea for addressing economic inequality in Bermuda. Yearly deficits in millions. Mr. Speaker, I can recall back in 2020 when the OBA became government and had to borrow money to pay for the ongoing expenses to run the government. Money had to be borrowed as there was massive inherited debt, while stimulus program took effect. Government spending was reduced gradually in an effort to avoid mass redundancies of civil servants. The OBA determined that the debt ceiling was required to clean up the mess and set a $2.5 billion cap. The OBA inherited a machine running an operational deficit of $100 million and an overall deficit of $219 million in 2012-2013. The OBA handed over a government running an operational surplus of $166 million, and an overall deficit of $8 million, excluding the sinking fund contribution in 2017-18. The debt was being significantly addressed. Mr. Speaker, for those honorable members wishing to take political points with the debt, it is worth noting that during the last fiscal years of the PLP government, i.e. 2008-9 to 2012-13, the debt grew by 320% from $335 million to $1.408 billion. From the start of the times of plenty in 2001 until the year of the election in 2012, the debt has grown by 1,045%, or 11 times over. Mr. Speaker, it would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the comments made by Bermuda's Auditor General about Bermuda's national debt. She underscored her concern by stating that, as in her previous reports, the government continues to make decisions without knowing the combined financial position of all the organizations that make up the government's reporting entity. She further added there was no effective, comprehensive long-term plans for reducing the annual and accumulated deficits or associated debt, the unfunded liabilities of its major pension plans, or the size of taxpayer indebtedness, all of which continue to grow unsustainably. Mr. Speaker, this continued behavior must stop, and fiscal prudence should and must be addressed if we are going to bring our national debt into check. It is time to introduce fiscal responsibility legislation which places a ceiling on the annual expenditure growth. Do we also have a place of an added feature which places a ceiling on our debt to GDP ratio? This should not be dismissed, as our debt service is close to 60% of our GDP, and each Bermudian worker is carrying $133,000 of the government debt. Healthcare. Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance believes that all Bermudians should have access to affordable, high-quality health care. Through true and transparent consultation, the OBA recommends that government work with all sectors involved in the delivery and financing of health care in Bermuda to reduce the cost of health care, tackle chronic illness, and ensure equal access to care. Every Bermudian has a right to health insurance coverage that is evidence-based and managed by independent professionals and not by the government. The legislation surrounding health care is fragmented, and we recommend that laws are brought up to date and unified to reduce the confusion surrounding our health care regulations. The supplemental benefit of the mental health needs to be regulated and protected to ensure that insureds are being covered at the same level as medical benefits. All of our people need more access to information about their healthcare policies, to have clear transparency regarding to the specifics of their coverage. We also recommend that the PLP government implement a unique patient identifier for everyone in Bermuda. This will ensure that everyone has coverage, reduce duplication of services, and drive down the cost of health care for all. It will assist in services being streamlined and produce a true number to those who are uninsured or underinsured, and to assist in developing solutions to reduce this subset of the population. But, Mr. Speaker, we must do more to tackle the root causes of poor health. So the One Bermuda Alliance recommends a national physical fitness program to ensure well-being, sound health, exercise, healthy diets from primary school throughout life. We would also recommend that is the introduction of a program that specifically targets non-communicable diseases underpinned with food cost reductions for healthy living, aging population and its impact on Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, according to Bermuda's Department of Statistics, Bermuda's population projections 2016 to 2026, as baby boomers age over the coming years, more persons will be reaching the retirement age than in the past. Due to declining fertility rates, it may be difficult for employers to ensure enough qualified young Bermudians to fill these vacant posts. Also, as indicated by the increasing old age dependency ratio, there will be a greater proportion of elderly dependents who may need to be supported by the working population. One possible solution to address this would be to increase the mandatory retirement age of 65 in some industries, or to eliminate it altogether, as an earlier retirement age diminishes the labor pool. Aside from the substantial immigration, another way to increase the labor supply immediately will be to bring more of the elderly into the workforce. In the future, the needs of the elderly will likely shift public policy and the provision of services. Finding affordable care providers for seniors could become more challenging than finding child care providers. More or larger retirement facilities, senior citizens daycare programs, and in-home care services will also be required. As a result, Bermuda's growing population will mean added challenges in upcoming years. Again, Mr. Speaker, to remedy this situation, we need to expand our workforce. We need more local jobs so that we are able to collect the revenue to fund our pensions and care for our seniors. Resources needed for chronic health conditions. Mr. Speaker, the population projection report also states that of all residents, 7.2% were 75 years and older in 2016. By 2026, this proportion is anticipated to increase to 10.8%. The increase in the proportion of older seniors will likely increase the demand for purpose-built residential facilities with trained staff. This is inevitable, as with increasing age, seniors are more likely to have chronic health challenges that may require the assistance of another person or permanent care in an institution. Mr. Speaker, according to the 2010 consensus, 77% of seniors had a long-term health condition, compared to 35% of persons under the age of 65. Also, 14% of seniors had a disabling long-term health condition, in comparison to 4% of the population under 65 years of age. The 2014 health survey of adults in Bermuda indicated that seniors were more likely to have hypertension, diabetes, and cardiovascular diseases. Mr. Speaker, rising healthcare costs outpaces inflation. In 2004, each Bermuda household spent $7,000 a year on healthcare, a 156% increase from the amount spent in 1993. This represents a greater increase in healthcare expenditure than the 32% rate of inflation during that similar period. The amount each household spent on healthcare was roughly $10,300 on average in 2013, a 47% increase from 2004. This was also a greater increase than the 30% rate of inflation during the period. In 2013, households headed by seniors spent $10,919 per year on household, up from 6,000 in 2004. 76% of the expenditure was comprised of health insurance. Mr. Speaker, the report indicates that Bermuda's healthcare system shares of gross domestic product is the third highest in the OECD countries. This is of concern, as although this may reflect prioritization of health in an economy, it also highlights the need for improvement in health system efficiency. Employment. Mr. Speaker, as we review government finances and the state of our economy, it is shameful that this government does not have the latest employment statistics for 2020. Mr. Speaker, you may recall that the latest report was issued in September 2020 by the Cabinet Office under the leadership of the Honorable Wayne Furbert, JP, MP. And that report referenced the week of April 25th to August 31st, 2019. The annual employment survey is a census of all business on the island and serves the purpose of providing a broad count of all filled jobs in the Bermuda labor market. That said, Mr. Speaker, our economic review indicated that 1,935 jobs were lost in 2020, which is a 5.6% reduction. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda's young people have been hit particularly hard by the labor market fallout from the coronavirus, with workers aged under 24 accounting for nearly half of the total fall in employment during the economic crisis. At the same time, there's a strong evidence that more people are chasing fewer jobs, so our young people are struggling to enter the employment market. Significantly, young people account for 46% of the overall fall in employment during the pandemic, even though they only account for just 1 in 9 in the workforce. What strategies and programs will this government establish to address this job loss glide path? Is it time to provide more resources to foster and support entrepreneurial opportunities? As a senior economist at the Bermuda College recently said, we need to support more young people who are working in the gig economy, which will be a significant part of the engine to drive our economy. Local retail sales. Mr. Speaker, when looking at the sales figure, it became very clear that consumer demand was stronger than ever. The demand straddled across all business sectors. When looking at the latest sales index figures, it became very clear that consumer demand was stronger than ever, as was evident in all sectors. This, we believe, was directly attributed to the coronavirus lockdown and the dramatic decline in non-essential overseas travel by our residents. People have more discretionary income and shop locally. They spend much less on travel and vacations overseas, and more was spent in Bermuda. We shopped locally, we made minor renovations to our homes, we purchased new furniture and vehicles, and stocked up on essentials like groceries, toiletries, and beverages. Mr. Speaker, according to the Government Statistics Department, sales volumes increased 7.9% after adjusting for the sales rate of inflation, which was measured at 0.8% in October. The overall volume of retail sales increased 7.9% when compared to October 2019. This confirmed that the growth was attributed mostly to increased spending on the island by residents. In value terms, retail sales rose 8.8% to an estimated 99.5 million. 6 of the 7 retail sectors recorded higher sales volumes, with the motor vehicle recording the largest volume increase of 21%. Building materials were up by 5.15%. Service stations were up by 1%. Apparel stores were down by 11.9%. Food was up 7.2%, and liquor sales were up by 17.7%. Mr. Speaker, according to Minister Wayne Furbert, while the restrictions on travel had a significant limiting impact on local retail activity, they actually substantially boost selected overseas declarations, which are defined as declarations via courier, by residents via the airport, by households via sea, and via the Bermuda Post Office. The value of the total of those categories is seen as continuously increasing for the 5th consecutive month since May 2020, compared to August 2020. Overseas declarations in September had reported an increase of 6.6%. Tourism and hospitality. Mr. Speaker, according to a tourism economist and specialist, Adam Sachs, Bermuda's tourism industry will recover nearly fully from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic by 2023. He stated that tourism in Bermuda will operate at 20% of 2019 levels in 2020. It will improve to 67% this year and reach 79% in 2022 and 94% 3 years from now. He said part of the strategy is survival in the 3-year period to get to this point. Mr. Sachs said he expects the first half of 2021 to be very difficult, but said the second half of the year will see an improvement. He said tourism accounted for 19% of the island's gross domestic product, nearly 1/5 of Bermuda's economic output, adding 20% of all jobs are directly and indirectly supported by the visitor economy. He further stated that Bermuda has reinvented itself and approached the market in innovative ways and has done it while staying true to who we are. He added that the loss of 80% of our tourism economy this year was a massive call to action to do all that we can from a policy and strategic standpoint to restore a central pillar of the Bermuda economy. Considering the above, Bermuda has shown steady improvements since the airport reopened in July 1, hitting 16.1% of the 2019 visitor volumes earlier this month. We still have a ways to go, but this will be challenged because of the recent spike in coronavirus in the east coast of the U.S., which is our core market. We should also support the industry by increasing the number of seats and flights available to visitors. We will also continue to position ourselves as one of the international COVID-19 safe havens. Mr. Sachs went on to indicate that the time is right, as a survey in the U.S. showed that only 50% of American households felt safe traveling outside of their community. This was reflected in figures that showed that their air travel by Americans was at 1/3 the previous levels, and is likely to increase in the coming months as studies show that air travel is relatively safe compared to other activities. While 11 million Americans remain out of work, he said the high-income earners were least affected by lost job losses. Those people, those high earners, are our customers. Mr. Speaker, despite this outlook, the government expects a paltry passenger tax of $4.5 million. The same principle applies to the transport infrastructure tax, which was allocated a negligible $2 million. This speaks to government's dismal outlook for 2021-22. Are they not listening to the professionals in the industry? Mr. Speaker, another feature that jumped out in the budget statement was the $10 million guarantee for the Bermuda Beach Hotel to support the second phase of its development. This is a philosophical turn around for the Minister of Finance, who thrashed the One Bermuda Alliance for its hotel guarantee program. Education and Bermuda College. Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance has long stated that the way forward for education is to have it overseen by an independent education authority. So we are delighted that the PLP finally sees the value that an education authority can bring to the delivery of education in Bermuda and student performance and outcomes. An education authority is not the cure, Mr. Speaker, but it is the first and necessary steps towards establishing a system that provides the foundation for our young people to succeed. We also recommend the establishment of a continuing professional development center for our teachers to enhance teaching skills and maintain high standards with continuous training support. It is also crucial that both teachers and students receive the support they need. So, Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance urges the government to supplement schools with teams of foundational counselors to support our children and instill the skills needed for life, from early development learning to guidance in later years when children transition from education to working life. Government should protect the Bermuda College from the financial impact of the crisis so that it can maintain and enhance its critical role within our community and take decisive steps to align their teaching and learning provisions to meet business and employer needs. Mr. Speaker, in 2017, the Progressive Labor Party released its general election platform. In it, it pledged to reform public education by phasing out middle schools and introducing signature schools at the secondary level, with a focus on learning styles and interests of our children, including academic, technical, and the trades, business, sports, arts, and the special needs education. Instead, now the focus is on primary schools. The government is expected to close 9 of the present 18 primary schools and replace them with parish primary schools, 1 in each parish except Pembroke, which will have 2. Under the plan, a new primary school will be built in Devonshire, with 2 existing primary schools to be converted into an alternative signature school and a replacement for the Dame Marjorie Bean Hope Academy. This proposal to close half of Bermuda's primary schools was not mentioned in the 2017 election campaign. That is understandable, as it might not have been thought of, but surely it should have been mentioned in the 2020 PLP platform when the government sent Bermuda voters back to the polls. Mr. Speaker, it's sad to state, but this budget ironically has said very little about this educational structuring and the reconfiguration and redevelopment of our school campuses. In fact, there was an $8 million allocation reduction for the Department of Education. We look forward to an explanation for this reduction. Sports. Again, Mr. Speaker, there was no mention of sports in this budget report and the further development of our young people. In fact, it was noted that the Ministry of Youth, Cultural Affairs, and Sports Headquarters had a reduction of 38% in allocation. Is this department not valued? Mr. Speaker, we all know that education and sports provides discipline, self-respect, responsibility, and growth to our young people. They are our future, and nothing was addressed in the budget to concentrate on the development of our young people. Yet this government spends resources on the development of cannabis industry with very little said by the ministry in support of our youth. The arts and creative sector. Given the significant contribution of the arts, culture, and creative industries to Bermuda's economy and our social fabric, the government should take steps to protect this sector and look for ways to increase public and private investment in the arts in Bermuda. the philanthropic sector. Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance believes that government should take action to protect the capacity and financial sustainability of the third sector in recognition of its important role in building and supporting Bermuda's social fabric. We should examine the scope for longer-term funding arrangements for social services which support our families, our seniors, and the development of our young people. There should be new initiatives to incentivize private investments into this sector. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I would like to take a moment to once again acknowledge the sterling contributions of the late Anthony Mandus, former Financial Secretary at the Government of Bermuda. He was a force to be reckoned with and would have been an integral part of this budget process. His untimely death earlier this year is still having impact on all who knew and respected him. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance asserts that there is a way forward, but there is much work to be accomplished. From a health perspective, it starts with each one of us who call Bermuda home. We must continue to adhere to the COVID-19 protocols to ensure that not only are we safe as individuals, but the knock-on effect will also be a safe community which bolsters our economy as tourism returns, business reopens, jobs are filled, and investors will return to our shore. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda has proven time and time again that we can weather the storm if we work together. The One Bermuda Alliance fervently believes that if Bermuda is to move forward from the darkness of the pandemic into the rays of hope which are just ahead of us, the issues outlined in this submission must be addressed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.